I'm sitting comfortably. So, Jeremy, are we ready to begin?
We are.
Would you like to unmute as well? Yes. Welcome, everybody. Delighted to see you all on today, the second day of Hanukkah. And Hanukkah, we light the second light tonight. And let me say at the outset that we need all the light that we can shine on us at the moment. Things are rotten. Let's hope Hanukkah helps to lighten the situation up in Israel, Gaza, and everywhere. I'm delighted to welcome Lyn Julius today. Lyn's subject is Nakba. We all know that Nakba means catastrophe, and we also know that the very day that the partition plan for Palestine was announced, the day after, the Arabs celebrated. They celebrated, and they have a rather horrible way of celebrating, as we found out on the 7th of October this year. As it so happens, on the 7th of October, Lyn was in Tel Aviv with her grandchildren, her son and grandchildren, and she tells me what she was doing when the siren came was herding her grandchildren into the safe room. And she also tells me that she was very reluctant to leave them and come back home, but we're so glad you did, Lyn, because you're here today to be able to tell us your wonderful story. Lyn's family hails from Iraq, and her subject, as many of you probably know, is the Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. In fact, she's written a book, I think you'll see the title in the chat, called Uprooted, How 3,000 Years of Jewish Civilization in the Arab World Vanished Overnight. Lyn is also, there he is, there's the book.
It is.
A great cover, Lyn.
Thank you, thank you.
And Lyn also co-founded a group specifically for that purpose called Harif. In fact, I zoomed in to JW3. As I'm in Manchester, I couldn't go there in person, but I zoomed in because Lyn gave a fascinating introduction on that day, which does commemorate, every year they do commemorate the Nakba. So that was something that I managed to hear. Thank you, Lyn. That was most impressive. So thankfully, she came back. Lyn, by the way, just to give you some personal background, Lyn is married to Lawrence, who belongs to, they both belong to the Holland Park Sephardi and Portuguese Shul. Lawrence apparently is their deputy to the Board of Deputies. And even more important, he's a techie. He's the technical genius that has helped Lyn to do her presentation today. So thank you to Lawrence as well. They have 4 children, 2 of whom are in Israel, the others are in London. And we're so glad you came to talk to us, Lyn. We're looking forward to hearing from you. I just want to say, I did ask Lyn the meaning of the word Harif, which is the name of their organization. And apparently in Arabic, it means autumn. But Harif in Hebrew means spicy, sharp, bright. And I also think it means passion. And it's that very passion that Lyn has for her subject. Lyn, over to you. The screen is yours. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Geeta, and thank you all at Abraham Events for welcoming me so warmly. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. As Geeta mentioned, we do have an organization called Harif, which is the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, and we run a regular Zoom program about aspects of history and culture of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, but you don't have to be one in order to join our meetings. So if you are interested, please just go to our website, which is www.harif.org, and subscribe to our mailing list, and we would be happy to send you all the details. So, yes, thank you. I have actually made a speciality, I suppose you could call it, of the history and culture of Jews from the Middle East because of my own background. But actually, when I started out about 20 years ago, I didn't know that much about the subject, and I've been kind of collecting information about it. But today, I'm not going to talk just about Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. I'm also going to talk about the Nakba, which is an Arabic term and refers to refugees, Palestinian refugees. So we will ask the question, what is the Nakba? Is it a recipe for everlasting war in the Middle East? And why is something that occurred 75 years ago still relevant? Is there a Jewish Nakba? And can awareness of both Nakbas lead us to peace and reconciliation? So since Gita asked me to talk about this subject, obviously the massacre of the 7th of October happened, and Israel finds itself at war with a deadly and cruel enemy, Hamas. So I'll just share my screen. Can you see that?
Yes, yes, we can.
Great.
We can also see Lawrence. Are you going to stay in the picture, Lawrence?
I'm just doing my bit in the back.
Yeah, he's just... So,
Okay.
yeah, okay. So if you can all see that, is the Nakba a recipe for everlasting war? So as I was saying, Israel is at war with Hamas. Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they are often described as Islamic Palestinian nationalists, but they are not particularly interested in Palestine. Indeed, Hamas founder Mahmoud al-Zahar has said, "For us, Palestine is like a toothpick for cleaning our teeth because we have a much bigger plan." So like ISIS, they do not recognize borders. Their plan is to establish an Islamic caliphate. They want to conquer Israel for Islam. They are thus engaged in a religious war to kill or subjugate Jews. And this aim is enshrined in their charter, which is full of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. For instance, the Jews caused the French Revolution, they caused the Russian Revolution, they want to dominate the world. Now, most people recognize that you can't do business with people who want you dead. But almost as soon as Israel took up arms against Hamas in Gaza, diplomats and politicians were saying that there cannot be a military solution. There has to be a political solution, a two-state solution. And President Biden has said this several times. And with whom should Israel negotiate a two-state solution? The Palestinian Authority, who rule in the West Bank and who are thought to be more moderate than Hamas. Some even think that the Palestinian Authority should rule Gaza after Hamas has been defeated. And only this morning, an article in the Times of Israel said that the US is planning for post-war Gaza with Ramallah, that's the capital of the West Bank, even as the Palestinian Authority hopes to ally with Hamas. Well, that's a pretty horrible prospect. I think you might agree. So the Nakba is the narrative developed over the years, not by Hamas, but by the secular Palestinian nationalists, the Palestinian Authority. So I shall try and trace the evolution of the concept of the Nakba and explain why I think the Nakba makes peace less, not more likely between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. As most of you know, this year is the 75th anniversary of the State of Israel. It was on the 14th of May, 1948, that David Ben-Gurion made his famous declaration at Independence Hall in Tel Aviv. Hardly was the ink dry on the Declaration of Independence than 5 Arab League states, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon, Yemen and Saudi Arabia also joined in by sending expeditionary forces. Hardly had the ink dried than these 5 Arab states declared war on the new state of Israel. And in the last 75 years, states like Egypt and Jordan have signed peace treaties, and Morocco, the UAE, Sudan, and Bahrain signed the Abraham Accords. And Saudi Arabia, it is thought, was about to, just before the 7th of October. But others, such as Iraq, Libya, Syria, are still at war with Israel. And the Palestinians, I'm talking about the moderate Palestinians led by Mahmoud Abbas, have not discussed peace with Israel for about 10 years now. Indeed, this year, the 75th anniversary year of Israel, the Palestinian Authority have made determined efforts to push a narrative of the Nakba. So the UN Committee on the Exercise of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, assisted by the Division for Palestinian Rights, commemorated the 75th anniversary of the Nakba at the UN headquarters in New York on the 15th of May, 2023. And this is the day after Israel was declared a state, on the 14th of May. For the first time in its history, the UN passed a resolution in November 2022 to commemorate the Nakba officially. On Nakba Day, the General Assembly was convened. The Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas made a speech, and a cultural event featuring Palestinian musicians was held. So what is the Nakba? The Nakba is an Arabic word meaning catastrophe. There are 2 explanations for the nature of the catastrophe. The most recent is the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs from their homes. So how many are we talking about? Well, estimates range from 350,000 to about 711,000 according to UN figures. Palestinians suffered an unquestionable human tragedy in 1948. Men, women, and children lost their homes. 2/3 remained within the borders of Palestine. They were dispersed to the Jordanian-occupied West Bank, the Egyptian-occupied Gaza Strip. They also fled to neighboring Arab countries. 90% have since passed away, but official figures have ballooned to over 5 million, even though the great majority were not born or have never seen Palestine. Uniquely, Palestinians are the only refugees who can pass on their refugee status from generation to generation. So 4 or 5 generations later, Palestinians are still designated as refugees under the care of an exclusive UN agency, UNRWA. Except in Jordan, they're not allowed to become citizens of their host Arab countries. In fact, the Arab League passed a resolution, 1457, in 1959, forbidding Arab states from granting the refugees citizenship. The refugees are not allowed to resettle, and they suffer from other restrictions. For instance, they're not allowed to do certain jobs or cannot own property, particularly in Lebanon. So how many were expelled and how many fled of their own accord is a matter of dispute. There were instances of expulsion, for instance, from Lod and Ramle. Atrocities were committed on both sides. The refugees were fleeing a war zone. But it is often pointed out, had the Arabs accepted the partition resolution, there would have been no violence and no displacement. In fact, it is said there would have not been a single Arab refugee, and the Palestinians would have been marking the 75th anniversary of their own state. It's important to realize that expulsions took place not because they were Arabs, but because they were hostile. Some 160,000 Arabs remained in what became the state of Israel. Abu Ghosh, an Arab village near Jerusalem, is an example where Arabs fought alongside Jews. They have excellent relations with their Jewish neighbors and have been able to flourish. The fact that 160,000 Arabs remained suggests that there was no deliberate Zionist policy of ethnic cleansing. Contrast with what befell the Jews. Not a single Jew was allowed to remain in areas conquered by the Jordanian Arab Legion. Every last Jew was expelled, and Jews in Arab countries were also forced to leave. More about them later. To quote Abba Eban, the problem of the Arab refugees had been a direct consequence of the launching of a war for the purpose of overthrowing by force the General Assembly's November 1947 resolution of partition. No great movements of population would have occurred if the Arab world would have joined with Israel in an attempt to give peaceful implementation to that resolution. The second explanation for the word Nakba is the catastrophic defeat of the Arab side as a result of the failed genocide of Jews by Arabs in 1948, in which 1% of the Jewish population died. Let's not forget that Arab leaders made their intentions clear. On the 14th of May, 1948, the Secretary of the Arab League, Abdul Rahman Hassan Azam, announced the declaration of war against Israel. This war will be a war of annihilation and a massacre not seen since the time of the Mongols and the Crusaders. So the respected Israeli writer and commentator Yossi Klein Halevi puts it this way. So when you ask me, where does the word Nakba hit me? My instinctive reaction is the very word catastrophe means the catastrophe of the Arab world's failure to destroy Israel. That's the real catastrophe they are mourning. And there's actually historic evidence for that. If you go back and see how the word Nakba was first used by the first Arab journalists responding to 1948, it was the catastrophe of the Arab world's defeat, their military defeat. even before they spoke about the refugee issue. The 1948 Nakba was followed by the lesser known Naksa in 1967 after the Six-Day War. That's the meaning of Naksa, is the disappointment or setback. And this characterizes the defeat of the Arab countries by Israel in just 6 days. So historically, the word Nakba was actually coined by a Syrian Christian historian and journalist called Konstantin Zurek. Zurek taught at the American University of Beirut, and writing in his book, The Meaning of the Disaster, Zurek said, the defeat of the Arabs in Palestine is not a small downfall or naksa, it is a catastrophe, nakba, in every sense of the word. Zurek also wrote, 7 Arab countries declare war on Zionism in Palestine. 7 countries go to war to abolish the partition and to defeat Zionism and quickly leave the battle after losing much of the land of Palestine and even the part that was given to the Arabs in the partition plan. He concluded, we must admit our mistakes and recognize the extent of our responsibility for the disaster that is our lot. So Zurek saw the Nakba as a pan-Arab catastrophe, but over time it has morphed into an exclusively Palestinian catastrophe for which Israel is to blame. But Zurek is not the first person to have used the word Nakba. In fact, it goes back to the 1920s, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed and Britain and France divided the spoils between them. Britain got Palestine and France got Syria. But Palestinian Arabs saw themselves as Syrians. They were enraged that the southern Syrians were being hived off from the northern Syrian homeland, and that was a Nakba. In 1920, both sets of Syrian Arabs, those in Syria and those in Palestine, rioted violently. The riots were instigated and led by the man who would later become known as the father of Palestinian nationalism, the Palestinian Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini. And the Arab historian George Antonius described these riots in his book, The Arab Awakening. Zurek revived the term in 1948, as we have said. In the 1950s, more writers used the word Nakba to ascribe all blame to the Israelis for what was a consequence of a war instigated by the Arab side against Israel. In the 1980s, the Nakba narrative was given a boost by the Israeli New Historians. This group of Israeli scholars challenged the traditional Zionist account of the events of 1948. They tended to portray the Israelis as aggressors and the Palestinian Arabs as victims. However, in 2008, Benny Morris, considered to be the dean of the New Historians, decried the fact that his work was being used to prop up the Nakba narrative. In a letter to the Irish Times, Morris claimed that the events of 1948 were much more nuanced and complex. The Nakba would be catapulted to the fore by none other than the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. Arafat declared the first Nakba Day in 1998, and this coincided with Israel celebrating the 50th anniversary of its independence. This was after he had signed the Oslo Accords, promising to work towards the two-state solution. However, he interpreted two states as an Arab state on the West Bank and Gaza, and a second Arab state in place of Israel, two Arab states. The conflict was thus doomed to continue in perpetuity as long as Israel did not consent to its own self-destruction. And this is what he said on the first Nakba day that he declared. The Nakba has thrown us out of our homes and dispersed us around the globe. Historians may search, but they will not find any nation subjugated subjugated to as much torture as ours. We are not asking for a lot. We are not asking for the moon. We are asking to close the chapter of Nakba once and for all, for the refugees to return and to build an independent Palestinian state on our land, our land, our land, just like other peoples. Notice the language he uses is very much modeled on the language of the Zionists. He's talking about a dispersal around the globe, you know, Palestinian diaspora. They're all in exile, and their only requirement is to return to their own land. Since then, the Nakba narrative is gradually moved from the sidelines to the mainstream. It's been promoted by a number of NGOs who have received funding from the EU, or churches, for instance, the Arab Youth Association Baladna, which means our motherland, Al-Auda, the Return, the Coalition of Women for Peace, Gush Shalom, the Alternative Information Center, Adala, Mosawa, Mada al-Carmel, the Israeli far-left NGO Zochrot, which means remembering, was established. In 2014, Zochrot organized a conference to prepare for the day when Arabs would reclaim their property inside Israel. This was a dystopian scenario that would likely end in a bloodbath. Zochrot released a smartphone application in 2014, which provides a map and photos of depopulated Arab villages. Now, the object of all these groups is the Palestinian right of return. If 1 million or so Arab refugees, if 5 million or so Arab refugees and their descendants are allowed to return, they would overwhelm Israel demographically. And soon it would become another Arab state. Its first act would be to abrogate Israel's law of return for Jews. And so you can see how a terrible defeat of the Arabs has morphed into something else. The existence of Israel itself is the injustice. Israel is responsible for the uprooting, dispossession, and exile of the Palestinian people from their homeland. And it follows that only by dismantling the state of Israel can justice be done. Before long, Palestinians were able to count on the support of the international leftist coalition in street demonstrations and on college campuses. Activists chant the slogan that sums up the final goal of the Nakba narrative: from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. In 2007, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon conveyed his empathy to the PA President Mahmoud Abbas on the occasion of Nakba Day. The writer Shani Moore says that there was a big change in 2021 when the so-called human rights industry started adopting all the main tropes used by the Palestinians, accusing Israel of apartheid and violations of human rights. And what they did by this was to give the intellectual framework to the Palestinian cause. Israel has become fundamentally evil. Israel's birth in 1948 was a cosmic crime, and the only right path and the only historically inevitable path is for that crime somehow to be reversed. So what has been the Israeli reaction to all this? Well, most Israelis have never heard of the Nakba. In 2007, Israeli Minister of Education Yuli Tamir of the Labour Party allowed for a textbook that featured the Nakba to be included in the curriculum for Arab Israeli elementary students. And Tamir was perhaps typical of Jewish liberals who think Jews should understand the other's narrative, even if it means national suicide. All too many perfectly sensible people, including quite a few liberal Israelis, seem willing to ignore the deadly implications of the Nakba narrative for fear of being accused of insensitivity to another people's suffering. And Jews have called for the Palestinian narrative to be taught in Jewish schools. However, the Knesset has pushed back, passing the so-called Nakba law, which allows the government to reduce funding to any organization commemorating Israel's independence as a day of mourning. So we come back to this year's Nakba Day commemoration. Incidentally, 45 states boycotted the event at the UN, including the US. Speaker after speaker referred to the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, independence, self-determination, and return of the refugees in accordance with UN General Assembly Resolution 194. Journalists detected a notable shift in Mahmoud Abbas's speech, a hardening of his position, and he represents the moderate Palestinians. In New York, Abbas sported a little key in his lapel to signify the Palestinian demand for a right of return. And he was walking back an earlier statement that he no longer wanted to return to his native Safed. I am a Palestinian refugee. I want to return to my land, he told the General Assembly. I want Safed, he specified, to warm applause. The editor of the Times of Israel, David Horowitz, commented at the time that what Abbas said makes peace less likely than ever. Yet his change of stance barely registered in the reporting of the Nakba event. Now, Abbas called for UN General Assembly Resolution 194 of the 11th of December 1948 to be implemented. Article 11 of the resolution resolves that refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return and for loss or damage to property which under principles of international law or equity should be made good by the governments or authorities responsible. At the time, the Arab states who were members of the UN rejected Resolution 194 because they thought it would entail recognizing Israel and the status quo. Subsequently, the Arab states changed their tune and insisted on implementation of Resolution 194, which they interpreted as permitting unconditional return of the refugees. And Article 11 has become the cornerstone of their strategy. Of course, the resolution does not have any legal standing. It is a General Assembly resolution. It does not say that the refugees must be permitted. It says should. And crucially, it says that those wishing to live in peace with their neighbors may be permitted to return. In insisting on unconditional return, the Arab side leaves out the bit about living in peace. As we know, over the last 75 years, hostilities have not ceased between Israel and the Palestinians. In their book, The War of Return, Einat Wilf and Adi Schwartz say that return has always been the Palestinian objective, but no one in the West has taken it seriously. The West has indulged this fantasy, throwing money at the Palestinians. It has provided over $940 million, including $730 million in humanitarian assistance for Palestinian refugees. Wilf says the Palestinians have worked to maintain their intergenerational refugee status for one reason only: to keep the war of 1948 alive and avoid accepting its outcome in the form of the existence of a Jewish state in any part of the land. And Wilf and Schwartz blame the Middle East UN mediator, Count Folke Bernadotte, who you see on your screen, for giving UN approval to the Arab ambition to eliminate Israel. He was the first to make the refugees the international community's responsibility, and he was the first to enshrine the demand to return as a right. Bernadotte was actually assassinated by Leahy in September 1948. There's actually no such thing as a right of return in international law, and it is against international norms, although Israel has allowed small numbers of Arabs to return. There have been cases in other conflicts where refugees have been allowed to return. Some 600,000 Poles returned to Poland after World War II. Some 200,000 Algerians returned to Algeria after it gained independence from France. Some 10 million Bengalis came back to Bangladesh in 1972. But return has always occurred when the returning refugees belonged to the majority community and there was no conflict between them and the receiving country. So, as I've already said, return here is intended as a political weapon to subvert and destroy Israel as a Jewish state. Wilf and Schwartz argue that the Gazans have never recognized that Gaza is their permanent home. They see it as a staging post until they can return to Israel. And we see images on our TV screens of Palestinians yet again forced to flee their homes, from North Gaza to the south, from the south to the west. And pro-Palestinians are talking of a second Nakba in Gaza. They say that Israel wants to ethnically cleanse the territory and claim it for itself. They don't see it as their responsibility. What is interesting is that the fleeing Gazans are confined to Gaza because Egypt won't let them enter Sinai. Egypt wants the Palestinians to remain Israel's problem. So in his Nakba Day speech Mahmoud Abbas compared the Israelis and the Nazis, and 2 weeks later, Mahmoud Abbas signed a presidential decree making it a criminal offense to deny the Nakba. If found guilty of denying the Nakba, you could face up to 2 years in jail. And if this sounds like Abbas was mimicking the law enforced in some European countries against Holocaust denial, it is deliberate. The Palestinian propaganda machine has been pursuing a strategy to compare the Holocaust with the Nakba, as if the two events were on a par. Underlying the comparison is the suggestion that the Palestinians were innocent bystanders who paid the price for European crimes against the Jews. But as we know, there is plenty of evidence that the Palestinians collaborated with the Nazis. And had the Nazis been victorious in World War II, the Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, would have managed the extermination of the Jews in his sphere of influence. So was the Nakba an exceptional injustice? Those who wage a war to eliminate another people cannot complain that they suffered an exceptional injustice. And the claim to exceptionalism is also untrue because population transfers were common in the 20th century. They were an accepted way of resolving territorial disputes. 135 million people were displaced in conflicts during the 20th century. 10 million ethnic Germans, Greeks and Turks, million Muslims and Hindus swapped places on the Indian subcontinent as a result of the partition of India and Pakistan. But there's another set of refugees who were displaced by the very same Arab-Israeli conflict as the Palestinian refugees, Jewish refugees. So let's call this the Jewish Nakba for convenience. As many as 870,000 Jews were driven from or fled the Arab world at around the same time as the Palestinian refugees, abandoning billions of dollars worth of property. Now, outraged that nobody was mentioned what has become known as the Forgotten Exodus, an organization called Americans for Peace and Tolerance arranged on Nakba Day for vans to drive around US cities advertising the Jewish Nakba. And here's one such van. In 1948, 1 million Jews lived in the region, barely 4,000 remain. There were more Jewish refugees than Palestinian refugees, 850,000 as against 711,000. Today, you can count the Jews in these countries on the fingers of 1 or 2 hands, and some have no Jews at all. Here's a chart showing you the figures. And I'm informed that actually there are no more Jews in Syria since this chart was produced. So on the 16th of May, 1948, just as the Arab League declared war on Israel, the New York Times declared that a second war was being waged against their own Jewish citizens, whom they branded the Jewish minority of Palestine. Jews in the Middle East and North Africa were conflated with Israelis, and this is a crucial difference. Palestinians were fleeing a war zone. The Jews in Arab countries were non-combatants, sometimes thousands of miles away from the theater of battle, and yet they could be arrested, they could be jailed, and they could even be executed on trumped up spying charges for Israel if they were accused of Zionism. And the member states of the Arab League actually drafted laws reminiscent of the Nuremberg laws. The Jews were hostages to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Eventually, Israel mounted dramatic rescue missions, and the majority 650,000, mostly destitute refugees, fled to Israel, doubling the Jewish population overnight. 200,000 resettled in the West. So it's not a suffering Olympics between Arabs and Jews, but if we mention the Arab Nakba, we are compelled as a matter of law and equity to talk about the Jewish Nakba. Both were caused by the Arab League. And those who say that if Israel had never been established, the Jews would have continued to live in safety in Arab countries are mistaken. However, anti-Semitism predates the creation of Israel in the Muslim world. And the events of the 7th of October actually have stirred memories of previous massacres that have occurred in the Arab world, throughout the centuries before the creation of Israel. But the story remains forgotten or ignored. There are several reasons for that, which we can go into. But in terms of public diplomacy, Israel's failure to raise awareness of the Jewish refugees has been a disaster. It's only quite recently that justice for Jewish refugees has become a plank of Israel's foreign policy. So to conclude, over 50% of Israelis are themselves refugees from Arab and Muslim countries or their descendants. In the words of Matti Friedman, they are in Israel not because of the Nazis, but because of the Arabs. So a lasting peace agreement, which does not take account of the Jewish refugees, will not be based on truth. I do believe that linkage between the two sets of refugees could open up a window of opportunity for political accommodation. So a right of return for one set of refugees is untenable. Giving Jews from the Arab world a right of return to countries that threw them out is like asking a prisoner who's tasted freedom to go back to jail. Though no Jew would wish to return to an Arab country, except perhaps as a tourist. So the key to peace, I believe, is to recognize that the exchange of refugees is permanent and irreversible. And the biggest obstacle to the Palestinian refugee issue is the existence of UNRWA, which precludes a humanitarian solution to the refugees' plight. Refugee resettlement is the answer. I'd also add both sets of refugees deserve compensation. So I'll just, this is a picture of the Mabarot, or the refugee camps where Jews from Arab countries were actually placed when they arrived in Israel after 1948. And this is another trailer produced by that American group, which actually shows the Mufti of Jerusalem meeting Hitler in 1941. So how likely is a solution? Not very, as long as people are unaware or in denial of the Jewish refugee problem. And that's why Gilad Erdan, Israel's UN ambassador, was holding up this sign in the UN: we are more likely to end the conflict if more people are aware of the Jewish Nakba. That was taken last year, but Dan did it again. He raised the question of the Jewish refugees again this year in the UN. So, but until we get some sort of resolution, to answer the question, is the Nakba a recipe for everlasting war? I would say, unfortunately, yes. Well, for now, this is the challenge facing Israel. It's to defeat Hamas And perhaps the refugee issue will come up in subsequent weeks or months or years, and we can perhaps all start talking about how to achieve peace. So I'll stop there, and just to thank you very much for listening. I'll just stop my screen.
Thank you. Thank you, Lyn, so much. Someone has already put in the chat, Brenda Friedland, how few people really know the history. And the history, of course, becomes more and more toxic as time progresses, particularly after the 7th of October. Thank you so much for clarifying this. Whilst I'm sure people have got comments and questions, you can put your questions in the chat, but it really helps me and Lyn if, as people are doing already, you use the icon and put your hand up in the icon and I can see it. And whilst you're thinking of your questions or comments, can I just remind you that next week we have something very different, but not all that different. We have Ollie Ansfield and Roger Waltons, who have made a remarkable documentary about Israeli settlers. Now, Israeli settlers, as you know, they're either maligned or praised. And they have created a documentary called Settling the Facts. So do join us next week when the fragrant Lyn Nathan will be your host. And I'm sure that too will be a most riveting presentation.